Hello friends, and welcome to the Unfocused YouTube channel, your destination for all content in MTG, the gaming sphere, or basically whatever I feel like. Today I'm going with my first commander deck tech that we have, a Boros Blinks strategy. Red is a color that I've always wanted to include in those Blink decks, having some very powerful enters the battlefield effects. Things like Mana Echoes, Dockside Extortionist, and Perforos are the ones that come to mind. But every commander that centers around the Blink strategy never features red. So up until this point, this hasn't really been something that's possible, because I like to build around the commanders and have them be a part of what's happening. That was until Baldur's Gate. Our commanders that we have today are Abdel Adrian, Gorian's Ward, with the background Street Urchin. Abdel Adrian reads, for 4 and 1 white, legendary creature human warrior, when Abdel Adrian Gorian's Ward enters the battlefield, exile any number of other non-land permanents you control until he leaves the battlefield. Create a 1/1 white soldier creature token for each permanent exiled this way. And then choose a background. Street Urchin reads, for 1 and a red, a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have 1. Sacrifice another creature or an artifact. This creature deals 1 damage to any target. Now, if you have paid attention at all to what people have been saying about Abdel Adrian, you'd realize that it's quite a powerful effect. A lot of people have been comparing it to something like World Gorger Dragon, but in my opinion, this is more powerful. It's far more powerful. It has that same combo potential, but it's safer for your board, and you're also generating tokens, which solidifies the choice of red in this deck because we have a lot of ways to abuse and use those tokens that other colors might not. With the playstyle of the deck, I really want to abuse Abdel Adrian's ability to exile all of your non-land permanents. With this, we can really turn him into essentially a board-wide protection piece for everything. This can make it very hard for your opponents to take care of anything that's actually causing them problems, forcing them to get rid of your commander first, and in those cases, generating you value. And then Street Urchin is one of those cards that will let us take advantage of those tokens. We have a little bit of a mana sink, spending 1 mana and then sacrificing a creature, then will deal 1 damage to any target. This is basically just a less efficient Goblin Bombardment. This card being in the deck and in the command zone, that will help us gain value from having those creatures out and actually turn that into a win condition. Getting into the core of the deck, this is our build around. We have a few cards that help our deck run efficiently. These cards are Recruiter of the Guard, Imperial Recruiter, and Moon-Blessed Cleric. By extension, you could also throw Militia Bugler in this category. Imperial Recruiter and Recruiter of the Guard are going to search for creatures with either power or toughness, 2 or less respectively. So that's kind of what we win around. We're going to be building all of our creatures around power or toughness 2 or less for the most part, so that we can get pretty much any piece that we need at any point. And then for our other pieces that we might need, we also have Moon-Blessed Cleric for enchantment tutoring, which can be very vital as well with some powerful pieces in there. With Militia Bugler, 25 of the creatures in our deck are power 2 or less, which means pretty easy math. Theoretically, you should be able to hit at least 1 card each time. Overall, very good cards. Don't really need to tell you why these cards are great, but having Recruiter of the Guard and Imperial Recruiter makes that restriction a little bit less intensive than it normally would be just building around 1. And an ETB effect that we can also abuse makes this especially good in a Blinks deck. Getting into the main theme pieces, I want to touch on these before I get into our traditional ones, like our ramp and our card draw. We have our Blink effects. And it is important that I mention before we go into this that we focus on cards that will leave and then re-enter at the same time. This is important for some combos in the deck, and it is inherently more abusable than other Blink effects that will re-enter on certain phases, as we do not have to pass priority. Starting off, we have Cloud Shift, Justichar's Portal, and Flicker of Fate. These are just our standard instant speed value pieces that are going to be flickering. It's always good to have cards like these around so that we can have that instant speed interaction that can either protect our board or initiate a combo if we need them to. Very versatile cards that'll help us do a lot and gain a lot of value with our deck. Next up, we have Felidar Guardian. This is a powerhouse. With power 1, it is tutorable with Imperial Recruiter, which adds that extra layer of consistency for our deck. When Felidar Guardian enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So having a flicker effect on an ETB is, needless to say, very powerful, and especially in this deck, since it can generate an infinite combo with our commander. How that works is if we exile Felidar Guardian with Abdel Adrian, any effect that flickers Abdel Adrian after that will then have Felidar Guardian re-enter and have that effect trigger. From that point, if we have Abdel Adrian's enters the battlefield resolve before Felidar Guardians, then he will exile Felidar Guardian with that trigger still on the stack and targeting Abdel Adrian. thus reinitiating the combo. The next couple pieces that we have here are Restoration Angel and Wispweaver Angel. For the combo purposes of the deck, these do pretty much the same thing as Felidar Guardian, just without being tutorable. Now it is important to have these cards in the deck, regardless of not being tutorable, because it is important to fill out the flicker portion of our deck so that we can have that be a consistent strategy that we can rely on. Next up, we have Eldrazi Displacer. This is really good for filling out those flicker pieces, but this, even more so than something like a Restoration Angel, provides consistent value for our deck in having that on an activated ability. So long as we have one colorless, we can activate this and flicker something. It's one of the better cards in our deck for keeping our deck running when our commander is not on the battlefield, which is super important. Eldrazi Displacer's activated ability does require a colorless mana, but being in only 2 colors, it is very easy to accommodate, and we'll get into that when we talk about our mana rocks and our mana base later. The last piece in our main flicker strategy is Teleportation Circle. The effect is not super strong, but it is here to just generate us that value, like I said, when our commander is not out, just to give us something, or if our commander is, we're gaining extra. The important thing with Eldrazi Displacer and Teleportation Circle is that they are generating value for our deck when our commander is not out, but then they get even better when our commander is out, which is super important in deck building. Next up with this, we do have a mini subsection that I would like to talk about in bounce effects. These are good for generating that value. Of course, they can't be used in some combos in this deck that rely on flickering, but they are good effects for abusing enters a battlefield. First up, we have Rescuer Schwinga, which is the best of this kind of effect. It's flash speed 2/2. When it enters a battlefield, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. There are a lot of effects like this. Some of them only bounce creatures, some of them are not flash speed. It's the only one that does both of them. Next up, we have Stonecloaker, which actually fits 2 categories. So we have, when he enters the battlefield, it's gonna bounce a creature to our hand, which is great for us. And then when he enters the battlefield, he's also going to exile a target card from a graveyard. So it's gonna be graveyard hate and a bounce effect in the same time. Stonecloaker is a very powerful card in this deck. Now, getting into our main pieces, we're going to be talking about our ramp. So I'm going to split this up into our traditional ramp and then our more supportive ramp pieces, because I think that is important when we're talking about deck building. Traditional ramp, we have Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Springleaf Drum, Boros Signet, Liquimetal Torque, Mindstone, and Talisman of Conviction. There's not really too much to talk about here when it comes to the traditional ramp pieces. They're all pretty standard. Springleaf Drum is essentially 1 mana tap, generate 1 mana of any color in this deck. We are heavy creature based, again with 38 creatures in our deck and also generating tokens. It's not going to be very hard to meet that standard of just having 1 creature on the battlefield to tap for this. The reason that I include Liquimetal Torque over any other 2 mana rock is because of that second ability. Now, Boros is very good at dealing with artifacts and enchantments. The Liquimetal Torque, having that extra ability of turning a permanent into an artifact, can actually help us take care of some permanents we might not be able to otherwise. And then getting into our supportive ramp pieces, these are pieces that ramp, generate a lot of mana, but can be a bit dependent on board state. In these cards, I have Prosperous Partnership, Mana Echoes, Dockside Extortionist, Ashnod's Altar, and Phyrexian Altar. Prosperous Partnership is going to generate tokens for us, which is pretty good on its own. Generating extra tokens can help us gain that board state. But it's also one of those cards that helps us utilize the tokens that we're already creating. We can tap 3 creatures and then make a treasure token. Mana Echoes is an extremely powerful card that I feel needs no introduction. Of course, when we're generating soldier tokens, those are all going to be sharing a creature type, so we are going to be exponentially ramping up with colorless mana from Mana Echoes. Next up is Dockside Extortionist, one of the best effects in Commander, one of the best cards out there, especially in red. Generating a treasure token for each artifact and enchantment our opponents control on an ETB is going to be fantastic to abuse. And then our last 2 pieces, Ashnod's and Phyrexian Altar. These are both going to be benefiting from our token strategy. So we're going to be able to utilize those tokens for things that we might not otherwise. Of course, there's the obvious combat implication of our tokens, but now we can turn them into mana. And now we're going to get into card draw. First up, I'm going to be talking about our general card draw pieces, things that are universally good. In here we have Rumor Gatherer, Welcoming Vampire, Mentor of the Meek, Gold Clamp, and Outpost Siege. These cards are very widely used in both white and red, and they're all very good card draw pieces. Gold Clamp is going to be benefiting off of our tokens, as we like to do. Turning them into 2 cards for 1 mana is very great for our deck. Mentor of the Meek is a good ETB white draw effect. Of course, that will require us to pay 1 mana, but it is abusable. Rumor Gatherer and Welcoming Vampire are generally good white card draw spells that are especially good in this deck. With each flicker, they become a new Rumor Gatherer or Welcoming Vampire, which allows us to bypass that once per turn restriction that they would normally have. And lastly, Outpost Siege. This is super good in this deck just for having that versatility and also being a win condition with that passive damage, generating impulse draw when we need it, or generating damage when we need a win condition. The next few cards that we have here are cantrip type effects, cards that enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield and draw a card, which generally would not be good in other decks, but here they will turn into a card draw engine. These cards are Wall of Omen, Spirited Companion, Circuit Mender, Inspiring Overseer, and Priest of Ancient Lore. Not much else to say about these cards. These are just generally good cards for this type of strategy. Now we're going to be getting into removal. First up, I'm going to be talking about Plundering Barbarian. When it enters the battlefield, we can either choose to destroy an artifact or create a treasure token. A very simple card, but that flexibility makes it very powerful in this deck, ensuring that Plundering Barbarian will never be dead in a combo. Active Authority gives us insane value in this deck. Entering the battlefield and exiling an artifact or enchantment is good premium removal, and in a flicker deck, we get to completely ignore that second line of text, never giving this to any of our opponents and just abusing them with it. This next card is a Boros staple, Duergar Hedge Mage. Since we are just in white and red, it should not be very hard for us to get both 2 plains and 2 mountains onto the battlefield so that we can destroy an artifact and an enchantment every time this creature enters. After that, we have Kabira Takedown, which is a free roll. It's an MDFC. It destroys creatures. What more could you want? These next couple cards are very good combo pieces and flexible removal. I'm going to take a second to talk about these. Here we have Oblivion Ring and Fiend Hunter. Now the way that these cards work seems similar to what our commander does. And when it enters the battlefield, we can exile a permanent. And then when it leaves the battlefield, we return that to the battlefield under our control. And that's where the flexibility comes in, because we can use them like that. But apart from that, we can also use it as removal. How these cards work as removal comes with its wording. If you'll notice, the enters and leaves the battlefield triggers are separate. Normally with these kinds of effects, like in the case of Abdel Adrian, he exiles until things leave the battlefield. But with these being 2 separate triggers, it actually opens up a niche use case. If we can get Oblivion Ring or Fiend Hunter to leave the battlefield before their enters the battlefield trigger resolves, then we can use that as premium removal, exiling something without anything ever having to come back to the battlefield. Fiend Hunter does the exact same thing, except it only does it for creatures. A little bit less flexibility on what we can hit, also a very good effect on a tutorable creature. These 2 cards together can also generate an infinite combo. If we have our commander out, have Fiend Hunter exile our commander, and Oblivion Ring exile Fiend Hunter, thus bringing Abdel back to exile Oblivion Ring, we now have an infinite loop with these 3 cards constantly exiling everything. Next up, we have Petrovark. This card has the same wording as Oblivion Ring and Fiend Hunter, but for lands. With the enters and leaves the battlefield trigger being separated, this can be abused as removal or a flicker effect for our lands as well. If we use this for flickering, this can generate us mana or untap a crucial utility land when needed, or it can act as premium removal for those pesky lands that our opponents have. Vark has a lot of use cases that can make it a staple for this deck. Avalanche Riders is another land removal piece that we have, which is tutorable. It's always good to just fill out at least a couple of these kinds of effects as lands get more powerful in Commander. Next up, Mage's Attendant. This is a fantastic new white card that we have that helps us break the color pie a little bit. When it enters a battlefield, it's generating a token, which is good for our deck, but those tokens read 1. Sacrifice this creature. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. We amass enough of these tokens and we have enough mana open, we can get a lock on the board. Mage's Attendant is a very good card that gives us instant speed stack interaction we wouldn't otherwise have. Next up, Dawnbringer Cleric, another case of flexibility, winning overall. When it enters the battlefield, we can either gain 2 life, destroy an enchantment, or exile a card from a graveyard. Then our last piece that we have here for graveyard hate is Mardu Woe Reaper. It helps us round out that 1 mana value slot exiling a creature card from our graveyard whenever it or another warrior enters the battlefield, such as our commander. And then into the second half of our main theme that we're building around, the actual win condition half of this, we have our passive damage. This is also going to help us when we have creatures to take care of, as we don't have targeted removal pieces that deal with creatures. In this section, we have Purphoros, God of the Forge, Goblin Bombardment, Impact Tremors, Daggercaster, Basalt Ravager, and the previously mentioned Outpost Siege and Street Urchin. Goblin Bombardment is a direct upgrade from our background. We can use this to take advantage of our creature tokens, turning them into a passive win condition, sacrificing them for no cost, and dealing damage to our opponents. Next up, Purphoros, God of the Forge. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we're going to deal 2 damage to each opponent. This is great at whittling at our opponent's health. On top of this, we are going to be gaining double the value that we would normally be gaining in any other deck, as Purphoros will get that trigger off of everything when it enters, and then every creature token that enters after we exile it with our commander. Purphoros being indestructible gives it that extra layer of protection on itself that really pushes it over the edge to be an insane level card that's hard to interact with. And on that same note, we also have Impact Tremors. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, we're going to be dealing 1 damage to each of our opponents. A lesser form of Purphoros' effect with less protection, but still worth the cost of putting it in the deck. And at 2 mana, this effect can't really be beat. And the last 2 we have here are Daggercaster and Basalt Ravager. Daggercaster, when it enters the battlefield, is going to be dealing 1 damage to each opponent and each creature our opponents control. This makes it able to take care of our opponent's board, while also dealing damage to them directly. Basalt Ravager is, just like Mana Echoes, going to be benefiting from having multiple creatures of the same type. When it enters the battlefield, we'll deal X damage to any target, where X is the greatest number of creatures we control that have a creature type in common. Basalt Ravager is going to be dealing a lot of damage on each ETB, and abusing that is going to make it very strong in this strategy. Next up here we have the Protection category. This is an archetype that I feel has really come into its own in Commander and become an essential piece to any deck. First piece that we have here is Guardian of Faith. This for our deck can essentially become a reusable Teferi's Protection. When he enters the battlefield, we can phase out any number of target creatures that we have, and if we have our commander, we can phase out any of our non-land permanents that are exiled with him as well. That's when Guardian of Faith becomes really good. When he's exiled with Abdel Adrian and we flicker him, we can reuse that as many times as we want, exiling any of our non-land permanents with Abdel that we want to protect, and then phasing him out with the Guardian of Faith. The next 2 pieces that we have here are insane value pieces in our deck that can also be generating some combos. Here we have Cosmic Intervention and Fate's Reward. These cards are very good at just protecting your board. In the case of a board wipe, you can play one of these cards and have all of your permanents re-enter the battlefield. We're going to be gaining all of our enters the battlefield effects again once everything re-enters. And in the case of Fate's Reward, we can actually generate a combo off of this. If we get a sack outlet and something that can recur a spell, we can do this as many times as we want, as long as we are generating 4 mana each time. Speaking of recursion, let's get into the recursion category. Here we have Ardent Elementalist. It's a 2/2 human shaman, which whenever enters the battlefield, we return an instant or sorcery from our graveyard to our hand. So this is that case that I'm talking about, where we can return our flicker spells, we can return our Fate's Reward to our hand, and actually get an infinite combo off of it. And then we also have Trusty Retriever, which is just handy to have artifact and enchantment recursion. We want to have recursion for each type that we have. That way we can continue gaining value from things, even if somebody happens to remove them. And then the last couple cards for our recursion category, I would be silly if I were not to include these. We have Karmic Guide and Revelark. Karmic Guide is a tutorable creature recursion piece that brings them right to the battlefield. Revelark, while not being tutorable, can bring 2 creatures of power 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. These 2 cards on their own are going to be giving us enough value for inclusion in a heavy creature-based deck. We can continue bringing those back. Karmic Guide and Revelark, as many know, have a combo together as well. If we have that sack outlet, we can continue doing this as many times as we want, and also gaining value from another creature with power 2 or less. And then next up we have our utility pieces, combo pieces. These are things that didn't necessarily fit into other categories, but are essential for the deck or provide us a lot of value. Firstly, there is Dualcaster Mage, a tutorable creature that will copy an instant or sorcery spell when it enters the battlefield. Through this, we can gain generic value by copying ramp spells, potentially win the game by copying a game-winning spell such as a Torment of Hailfire, or protect our own game by copying counter spells to counter their counter. Another thing to note with this card is that it will go infinite with a flicker spell. We have something like Cloud Shift and we copy that with the Dual Caster Mage, we can infinitely flicker it, generating infinite triggers on any external enters the battlefield effects that we might have. Next up, we have our value doublers in Panharmonicon and Mirror March. Panharmonicon is pretty self-explanatory. Doubling our ETB triggers is a pretty good effect in an ETB-based deck. Mirror March is a little bit of a different one. This is kind of a pet card of mine. It's my favorite red card. Since we are heavily creature based, this does give us a lot of value whenever a non-token creature enters. We're going to flip a coin until we lose and create a token that's a copy of that creature for each flip that we win. This is doing a lot for us, creating extra tokens to either sacrifice or attack with to gain that extra pressure on our opponent's life totals, while also giving us extra ETBs for each one that we create. Next up, in the Web of War. This actually lets us play into that aggressive strategy, being a haste enabler that will also buff our creatures. Giving +2/+0 is essentially going to be tripling the power of each of our creature tokens and giving haste so that they can all swing in one turn. And it's very important when pressuring our opponent's life totals is our primary strategy. Next up, we have a really big hard hitter in Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack, for 1 red, you can put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Sacrifice the creature at the beginning of the next end step. This card is really good in this deck because it's not only going to let us cheat mana cost by paying 1 red mana for anything and also giving them haste, but we can also completely bypass that sacrifice effect by just exiling them with our commander or flickering them. On top of that, Sneak Attack is giving us instant speed interaction. Lastly, we have Hellkite Courser. This card is broken in this deck. When it enters a battlefield, you may put a commander you own from the command zone onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to the command zone at the beginning of the next end step. You play the Hellkite Courser and bring Abdel Adrian out onto the battlefield, exiling everything along with the Hellkite Courser. At the beginning of the next end step, you then return Abdel to the command zone, getting all of your ETBs again, including the Hellkite Courser. And you see where this goes. Now you're essentially flickering everything every turn. So that includes your opponent's turns. Along with that, we can completely expedite this process and turn it into an infinite combo if we have a sacrifice outlet. Essentially, every time the Hellkite Courser brings our commander out and we exile everything, just sacrifice it away with an Ashnod's or Phyrexian Altar or a Goblin Bombardment, and then the Hellkite Courser's ETB triggers again. Now you no longer have to pass priority to get the string going, and you can win the game. Hellkite Courser has a very powerful effect, which is very abusable in this deck, and being only a $2 card, it's doing so much. This has got to be the best card in the deck. If I were to name one card to be the best in the deck, it would be this one. Rounding out the utility pieces, we have some MDFCs. Shatterskull Smashing and Amiria's Call are both direct upgrades from basic lands with spells on the other side. Shatterskull Smashing can be good creature removal for us that will act as a mana sink, and Amiria's Call will give us protection for an entire round on the board. And we also have Ondu Inversion. Destroying all non-land permanents is a very powerful effect, and it's the only board wipe that we're running in this deck. However, this kind of effect is very strong here as it can turn out really one-sided. We have a lot of our board exiled with our commander and we wipe everything. Everyone is losing all of their non-land permanents while we only lose our commander. A very good deal. Next up, I'm going to be talking about our mana base. Starting off with the utility lands, we have the channel lands in Eiganjo, Seat of the Empire, and Sekensan, Crucible of Defiance. These are direct upgrades from basic lands. Really hard not to include. They just have that added flexibility of an extra effect in the rare cases that you might need them. After that, we have the pairing of Thespian Stage and Vesuva. Thespian Stage spending 2 mana and tapping to make a copy of a land, and Vesuva entering the battlefield as a tapped copy of any land on the battlefield. Now, as I said, lands are getting a lot more powerful in Commander, and we do have removal for them in those cases, but even better than removal is copying them. Vesuva gains a little bit of extra value, being able to be flickered with Petrovark, as I had mentioned earlier. In the case that a stronger land comes out onto the battlefield, you can always just flicker it and bring it back as something else. Next up, we have War Room. It's giving us the colorless mana that we need to accommodate Eldrazi Displacer, while also being something that's going to help us round out draws in the case that we might need them. And then the next effect for our utility lands, we have Command Beacon. This is really good for commander-centric decks. Since we are focusing a lot on our commander, we want to ensure that we can continue casting him, and in the event that our opponents keep taking care of him, we have that Command Beacon as a one-off effect that's going to bring him to our hand and help us cheat that commander tax one time. Lastly, we have Sanctum of Eternity. For 2 mana, you can tap it and return target commander you own from the battlefield to your hand, and activate only during your turn. The bounce effects, like I said, they're going to be good value, and this is going to be the best utility land that we have here because it's playing right into our main strategy. And finally, we have our mana base. Here we are running Holdout Settlement and Survivor's Encampment. Both of these cards have that same condition as Springleaf Drum, tapping and then tapping an untapped creature to tap for 1 mana of any color, or just tapping for a colorless on their own. These cards are auto-includes here as a creature-based deck. As mentioned before, it's not going to be a very hard restriction to meet, and in that case, these are just untapped dual lands. On top of that, they can also tap for colorless to accommodate Eldrazi Displacer if need be. These cards are very good here. From then on, we are just running basics with 11 mountains and 10 plains. And that's the entire deck list that I have for you guys. I do want to acknowledge here at the end of the video a couple of notable exclusions that I had in this deck, a lot of them being commander staples. Things like Teferi's Protection I did not include, simply because I have things like Guardian of Faith as a reusable protection piece, very similar to what Teferi's Protection does. It is less powerful, but Teferi's Protection can only be used once. Keep in mind that it does exile itself on cast. Cards such as Smothering Tithe, Mungara the Diplomat, Benny Brax, and Esper Sentinel are very strong in white decks. The reason that they're not here is because they don't synergize with what the deck is doing. As you noticed, with all the pieces that I picked out, if they need to stay out from Abdel's protection, they're providing extra value by doing so, like in the case of Perforos. Him staying away from Abdel's exile effect allows him to trigger multiple times more due to the creature tokens being created. A card like Smothering Tithe or Mangara requires your opponent's actions in order to work, and thus they cannot be protected by the commander, so they kind of lose synergy points there. Of course, those cards are not going to be weak in the deck, so if you guys choose to include those in yours and make a couple of cuts, that I completely understand. Swords to Plowshares wasn't included because I was already very heavy on removal, and with passive damage being my win condition theme, I have a lot of things that can take care of creatures. And then lastly, Ephemerate. This one might be a little bit weird at first. It's a 1 mana cost flicker spell, so this would fit exactly in the theme of the deck. But the problem with the card is actually its greatest asset in the rebound. With that rebound effect, it's going to exile itself on cast, and thus we can't recur it from the graveyard in those scenarios where we want to. That's the end of the video. The first deck tech, the Boros Blinks. Did I miss anything? Maybe some cards that would be great in this deck for the way that I built it that I, for some reason, looked over and didn't see. Do you have any different types of strategies with the deck? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, then don't. And consider subscribing. We got a lot of content coming out in the future for Magic the Gathering and various other content forums. See you later.